expert and Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University, Sir John Curtice. Thank you for coming on to Lunchtime Live. We are in a very unusual situation now, aren't we, with a Labour candidate that's not backed by Labour?
Unusual but not unprecedented. We should remember that, in fact, in the 2019 general election, Neil Hanvey, currently MP for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, was similarly disavowed by the SNP during the middle of the 2019 general election campaign on the grounds he made an allegedly anti-Semitic remark. He, however, still managed to get elected, although his vote was down on what it was in 2017, but it's just that the Labour vote fell even more, so he therefore managed to recapture the seat. And he was then subsequently readmitted to the SNP. There was also indeed a Conservative candidate in Leeds who was similarly disowned by the Conservative Party, again for an allegedly anti-Semitic remark. You can also see that his vote fell more heavily than you would have expected, although again, he still managed to pick up over a fifth of the vote. So it's unusual in a by-election, of course, that such an event is so much more clearly exposed in a by-election when it's the only candidate who's standing as opposed to one of 650. But we should remember that all parties have at times been in a not dissimilar place.
Yes, but what it leaves Labour with now, I guess, is just writing off that seat for now until a general election, I assume.
Well, we can't necessarily assume that the candidate whom the Labour Party has nominated will not still actually win this by-election in much the same way as Neil Hanvey still managed to win in Kirkcaldy in December 2019. We have to remember this is a very safe Labour seat, and that Labour are now much more popular than they were back in 2019 when they already had a 20-point lead. There was already a serious challenge, yes, from George Galloway, who does have form in persuading those from the Muslim community to vote for him because of Labour's stances, for example, on the Iraq War in the past. Although the truth is, and although there's a substantial Muslim community in Rochdale, it's not as big, for example, as it is in Bradford West, which is where George Galloway largely managed to win. But there will be a challenge there. Labour's vote will certainly take a hit. But we may still discover that the candidate whom Labour nominated will still end up being elected. It's just then he won't necessarily join the ranks of Labour MPs at the moment. His membership of the Labour Party is suspended. It may be in the end he is cleared and he joins their ranks. So perhaps more likely, the suspension will hold and that he won't be allowed to stand in the general election later this year. But I mean, there are already at least three Labour MPs that I'm aware of who are already currently suspended and who are therefore in effect not Labour MPs because of suspension over remarks that they've made that have been deemed to be anti-Semitic.
Does this, do you think, expose deep divisions within Labour over what's happening in Gaza, and what kind of impact could that have on a wider vote?
Well, I think the first thing one has to say is that all the polling evidence indicates, and there was some more out from YouGov yesterday, is that a majority of the public either say, I do not know which of the two sides I feel closer to. Indeed, that proportion has grown in recent weeks, or that they feel equally about both sides. There has, by the way, been something of a shift towards people being more sympathetic to the Palestinian side than the Israeli side, and it's now clear that there are rather more on the Palestinian side than the Israeli side. But of course, Labour's particular problem is that, first of all, while Conservative voters, if they take a view, Conservative voters tend to be sympathetic to the Israeli side, whereas Labour voters, if they take a view, and again, even there, it's a minority who take a view, are more inclined to take the Palestinian side. Of course, in particular, those from a Muslim background who are particularly much more likely to vote Labour are particularly likely to take the Palestinian point of view. And there was some polling out last week, somewhat controversially reported, that suggested that support for Labour amongst Muslims is currently down on what it was in 2019. That said, what one has to remember is that most constituencies like Rochdale, where there is a substantial Muslim population, are very safe Labour, And in current circumstances, therefore, one would not necessarily anticipate, even if it does cost Labour some votes, whether it would necessarily cost them much in the way of seats. Now, of course, there is a broader argument here, which you've also really referred to, which is, Sir Keir Starmer has used his attempts to get rid of anti-Semitism inside the Labour Party as an example of the way in which he says the Labour Party has changed. And he is wanting to argue that the reason why Labour is so far ahead in the polls is because of the way in which he's changed the Labour Party. Well, of course, the truth is we might want to suggest that actually perhaps the principal reason why Labour are ahead in the polls is because of mistakes made by the Conservatives, not least one, Boris Johnson and Partygate, and two, Liz Truss and her fiscal event. And to that extent, at least, again, we should not necessarily, insofar as that's the case, we should not necessarily exaggerate the longer-term impact of this row on Labour's chances in the general election, because in the end, voters seem to be voting Labour not because they necessarily feel enthusiastic about the change that Labour are offering or indeed have already effected within their party, as opposed to being unhappy about what they've experienced under Conservatives during the course of the last 4 years.
Professor